Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We're getting straight into something I find absolutely fascinating: narrow convergences. We're going to be playing detective today, uncovering exactly what happens when words literally etched into ancient stone clash head-on with one of the most famous texts in human history.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever wondered what actually happens when a hard physical artifact, something dug straight out of the dirt, seems to tell a completely different story than the biblical text? I mean, what do we do? Do we just throw one out, pick a side? Or is there a deeper, much more fascinating layer of truth just waiting to be uncovered if we know how to read the clues? So, to wrap our heads around this, we really need to understand this concept called narrow convergences. Now, in academic terms, we're not talking about broad, sweeping myths here, like a general ancient flood story. No, a narrow convergence is laser focused. It's a specific moment in history where a discovered archaeological artifact and a highly specific biblical passage directly intersect, or in some pretty dramatic cases, violently collide. Our first collision takes us back to the 1993 and 1994 archaeological dig seasons in northern Israel. Researchers there unearthed something called the Tel Dan Stele. Now, stele is really just a fancy word for a stone monument. But this nice basalt monument, it wasn't found standing proud, not at all. It was completely smashed to pieces. The fragments were discovered scattered around, humiliatingly repurposed as just ordinary paving stones and rubble sticking right out of a wall. It was deliberately desecrated by later peoples who were actively trying to erase the history written on it. But incredibly, the excavators managed to piece enough of it back together to read the old Aramaic inscription. And what they found? It sent absolute shockwaves through the academic world. Written out in ancient consonants, it read, Beit Yod Tav Dalet Vav Dalet. Now, what's really interesting here is the translation. Those consonants translate precisely to House of David. Think about that for a second. Before this artifact was pulled from the rubble, a major consensus among influential historians was that King David was likely just a myth. An idealized legendary figure with absolutely no footprint in the actual historical record. Well, this single piece of stone shattered that consensus overnight. It was literally the very first time David's name was found outside the pages of the Bible. And the scholarly fallout? Oh, it was incredibly dramatic. Some people were so attached to the idea that David was just a myth that they started leveling wild accusations of forgery. They literally suggested the excavators chiseled the text themselves. And when that was completely debunked, some made the desperate and honestly kind of comical claim that the text didn't say David at all, but rather Dode, which was supposedly some ancient god of love. But as the dust finally settled, the ultimate consensus prevailed. This is an authentic 9th century BCE inscription that definitively names David's historical dynasty. But here's the thing, solving one mystery immediately opened the door to a massive contradiction. The stele didn't just mention David, it boasted about the assassination of kings from the Omride dynasty. And this is exactly where our historical sources violently crash into each other. Let's look at the evidence. On one hand, the biblical book of 2 Kings explicitly states that an Israelite named Jehu was divinely anointed to assassinate the Omride family, basically wiping out King Ahab's line. But on the other hand, the author of the Tel Dan Stele, who was likely the Aramaean king Hazael, takes full, absolute credit for defeating and killing them. So let's play detective for a second. Who's telling the truth? Do you join Team Bible or do you join Team Tel Dan?
Well, let's look closer at the actual text, like true investigators. In 2 Kings chapter 9, the ancient Hebrew verb used to describe Jehu's actions translates to conspire. The text tells us Jehu conspired to kill the Omrides, but it remarkably leaves out a complete list of who exactly he conspired with. This deliberate wiggle room, it's a massive clue.
And when we flip back to the Tel Dan Stele, we find wiggle room there too. The Aramaic verb the Aramaean king uses to claim the kill can be read actively like I killed them, but it can also just as easily be read passively, as in they were killed. So the crucial takeaway here is this. We don't have to pick a side. It's not an either-or situation. The Omride dynasty had stabilized the entire region, so taking them out would have been a massive, highly complex operation. These texts brilliantly converge to show us that multiple agencies, Israelite factions under Jehu and Aramean forces under Hazael, most likely collaborated and conspired together to pull off the assassination. All right, let's move on and see how this builds our understanding of ancient history by checking out our second artifact, the Taylor Prism. This clay cylinder is a sanctioned royal record detailing the exploits of the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib. Specifically, it covers his third military campaign in 701 BCE, which was aimed at crushing a massive rebellion led by Judah's king Hezekiah. The prism outlines a terrifying, incredibly systematic march of destruction. Sennacherib moved with brutal efficiency. He swept through Phoenicia, pushed down the Philistine coastal plain, cut right across the Shephelah valleys, utterly destroyed the administrative hub of Lachish, and finally pointed his massive war machine directly at the capital, Jerusalem. Now, the destruction of Lachish wasn't just a military victory, it was psychological warfare. We know from archaeological excavations in Nineveh that Sennacherib decorated his royal palace with grotesque gold overlays depicting the siege. These visuals literally showed people being filleted and impaled. It was pure visual rhetoric. A brutal warning meant to thoroughly intimidate any foreign diplomats who dared step foot in his palace. But then Sennacherib reaches Jerusalem, and bam, the historical records collide again. And this brilliantly illustrates the complexity we're dealing with. The classic Sunday school flannel board account in the Bible highlights a miracle where 185,000 Assyrians fall dead in the night, saving the city. Yet the Taylor Prism aggressively boasts that Hezekiah was locked up like a bird in a cage and forced to pay a massive tribute. To make it even more complicated, a few specific verses in 2 Kings actually agree with the Assyrian text. They state that Hezekiah had to strip gold from the temple just to pay Sennacherib off.
So we're left with a glaring question that absolutely demands our attention. Did Hezekiah capitulate and pay off the empire, or did he stand firm and experience a miraculous rescue? I mean, how can these completely different accounts describe the exact same event? If we step out of that binary thinking, we can actually synthesize the facts from all the sources into a cohesive, if a little messy, reality. Here's what we know for sure. First, Jerusalem remained standing. It was not burned to the ground. Second, the rest of Judah's infrastructure was completely severely crippled. Third, Hezekiah absolutely paid a colossal tribute to Assyria to buy survival. And fourth, despite all his power, Sennacherib ultimately failed to sack the capital city. You see, Sennacherib's royal records boast heavily about destroying 46 different Judean cities, capturing countless slaves, and securing immense wealth. But all of this aggressive bragging was really just designed to distract from the 800-pound elephant in the room. The most powerful army on earth completely failed to depose Hezekiah and conquer Jerusalem. And this reveals the ultimate sleight of hand in our investigation. We have to remember that ancient historiography is not modern, fact-laced scientific reporting. It just isn't. Ancient history was deeply rooted in royal rhetoric and propaganda. You emphatically highlight your victories, and you expertly spin, or completely ignore, your failures. The Bible focuses on the theological miracle that the capital survived against impossible odds, while Sennacherib's scribes, they focus on the vast wealth extracted to hide the embarrassing fact that they just couldn't finish the job.
To truly understand these ancient texts, we have to become comfortable living in the gray. We must respect the ancient literary genres of rhetoric and persuasion. We've got to understand the fickleness and the nuance of ancient languages. And most importantly, we have to avoid the false dichotomy of pitting Team Bible against Team Archaeology. Because when we actually synthesize them, they don't destroy each other. They clarify the incredible, rich complexities of the ancient world. It really completely changes how you view the past, doesn't it? Which leaves us with this final thought. If ancient history was written to persuade, to boast, and to spin, rather than just to objectively record, what other historical facts that we take for granted are actually hiding a much more complicated, fascinating truth? Keep asking questions, keep looking at the evidence, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.